Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. It's Joanne Duklas here with the GDN network. I want to say hello and thank you for joining us today for the GDN Conversation Series. Session 2, actually. We're looking at paving the way, roadmaps for digital ecosystem capacity. This is part of a series we have developed in partnership with the Velocity Network Foundation. A part of our building out knowledge for the community and sharing with you some interesting things going on. For this particular webinar, we really want to look at what are the strategies for building effective digital ecosystems that are trust-based and that actually help you achieve and solve business problems, such as ensuring when a person moves their credential from one place to another, compliance is preserved, ensuring interoperability and the like. So thank you again for joining us. I'd like to say hello to my colleagues, and Justin, thank you for joining us. Tell us a little bit about you, your organization, and how you fit into this puzzle today.
Sure, be happy to. First of all, thank you, Joanne and GDN. I think this whole series is really a great thing. It's a topic with potential to really affect a wide swath of humanity, and very few people know much of anything about it. So I think the more chances we have to get more information out there, the better. So thank you for that. Um, First, I'm here representing the Velocity Network Foundation. I've been with Velocity for about 3 years. The foundation is a nonprofit consortium of leading kind of HR and ed tech companies that work to get together to create the governance backbone and the protocols for the Velocity Network. The Velocity Network is a blockchain-based decentralized utility layer that seeks to replace kind of the outdated, fragmented way that individuals curate, hold, and then share their career reputation, career credentials across the labor market. Neither the foundation nor the network itself are vendors. The network is, as I said, an underlying trust and interoperability framework that vendors, including many members of the foundation, build their solutions on top of. In terms of my background, I won't go too deep into it. Anyone can go on LinkedIn and kind of see the X, Y, Z of everything I've done. But I will say I took a bit of a non-linear path to end up here. I think some people have been kind of involved in this work for decades before getting to the point of speaking on this. I'm not sure if that applies to our colleagues here. But I went from law to public policy and politics to writing and now to Velocity. So there is some method to this kind of career madness, and that is almost all the jobs I've had, at least all those that I've enjoyed, I've felt that I've been able to do something that has some kind of meaning, some kind of positive impact on the world, at least as I define it. You can look through my resume and decide if you think it all had a positive impact or not, but it certainly, I think in many cases did for me. And really Velocity does very much kind of fit into that broad bucket. It gives people more control over their own lives. It makes it easier for institutions, including very important institutions, to find talent and get them into work faster. And it has many societal benefits as well. We can get deeper into kind of the why of each of those if you'd like. But that main reason, beyond generally liking to be gainfully employed, which is a major motivator as well, is really what kind of brought me to Velocity.
Well, thank you so much, Justin. Welcome. Colin, please introduce yourself and tell us what brought you here today.
Yes, thanks, John and GDN also from my side for the kind invitation to join today. So my name is Colin Tück. I represent the Knowledge Innovation Center, KIC, which is a small social enterprise that focuses on topics, the intersection of education policy and digitalization, mainly in Europe, but also outside. It's an organization founded by, let's say, people with a really strong interest in education policy for many years. And what we're doing now is implement several projects as well as service contracts for the EU or other clients in the areas of digitalization, skills, and innovation. What I'm here for specifically today, I think, is, two things that we're currently working on. One is a so-called European Higher Education Interoperability Framework, which is an initiative under the European Digital Education Hub, which in turn is an initiative launched by the European Commission to bring to gather stakeholders on all different topics around digital education in Europe at all education levels, from primary school to university. And that is something that KSC is co-implementing together with other partners under a service contract for the EU. I might also throw in a few words about a project called Quality Link that we are implementing in a consortium that is all focusing about data architecture for cross catalogs. On my personal background, I can only say maybe that I've always been working at the intersection of education policy and digitalization, which are, let's say, two of my passions. So that's
you're in the right place.
Exactly, I believe so. Yes.
Alex, thank you for joining us. Please share with us about DSU and your background and so on.
Thank you very much. My name is Alex Jackl, and I'm the CEO of Bardic Systems, which is a small data governance and data architecture firm. I primarily work with data standards and with supporting educational institutions in implementing large-scale ecosystems and utilizing standards to do that. And I think I can mirror almost everything that Justin and Colin said. And I'm a data geek. I'm very interested in how data works and how data can be turned into information. And I'm one of the things that I've been recently working on is an initiative since about 2018 called Data Standards United, which is really about taking all the data standards that exist in the educational and workforce area and actually having them work together and not reinvent the wheel, not replicate work, so that the limited resources we all have, we can actually use to move the entire ecosystem forward in the most sustainable and affordable way possible. And so I'm delighted to be in this conversation for moving that forward, and encourage everyone to always look out and see what everyone else is doing so that you don't have to do it.
So for the sake of our audience, what's interesting to me is we have a standards expert, a standards body with Data Standards United. We have a trust framework organization in the W3C realm with Justin at the Velocity Network Foundation. And Colin, we've got an organization and work that you're doing to help bring sense across several member states in Europe around the whole sphere of interoperability. So when I look at one of the baseline questions, this is if I was going to be creating a healthy, trusted digital ecosystem, what are some of the key elements? And I'm interested in each of your perspectives on this. I think I'll start with Colin on this one. When you think about creating a digital ecosystem in Europe, what have you found to be some of those key elements to think about? And you are, thank you. I was going to say you're on mute.
Yeah, thanks. I'm just, I hope it's not too noisy as I have the windows open over here, but I'm just muting myself in between. Maybe I should say a few words of background how this interoperability framework came about, because of course education policy in Europe is always a complex topic, because you have the EU that is trying to advance policies for cooperation and for mobility and exchange within Europe. At the same time, there is of course still a strong principle of subsidiarity and national competence for education in Europe. So you have an EU that is aiming to drive cooperation and mobility, but at the same time doesn't have regulatory competence in the field. And that, of course, has led to a situation where, on the one hand, there are numerous initiatives for transnational cooperation of universities, and the most important landmark initiative recently is maybe the so-called European University Alliances, where you have now 64 alliances of universities, usually around 7, 8, 9 universities from different countries that try to build sort of a European university as an alliance of for cross-national cooperation. And of course, these initiatives have faced issues with existing different regulations at national level, and of course also with a multitude of different existing technical and semantic standards for various things. And that's why at the same time the vision is that these European universities and ultimately maybe not only the European universities but also beyond that would create a sort of a joint virtual campus where students can really move around seamlessly between countries and study one course here, one micro-credential there, without and ideally with having a fully portable user account, a wallet where they keep their credentials, and so on. This European University Initiative has then shown that it's really a huge challenge for these alliances to make that possible, because in some areas we have an absolute lack of European standards, and in other areas we actually have a multitude of standards that people could potentially use, and you have an alliance of maybe 9 universities coming together that already uses different standards internally. So I mean, one of the key messages that has emerged from all this discussion, where we did a long comprehensive inventory of what are the use cases where interoperability is needed, what are the existing standards and protocols we have, is that of course there is often also a technical problem, but in general the technical problem is only like the tip of the iceberg maybe, and there is a huge there are of course huge challenges at the level of semantic interoperability and organizational interoperability, or business interoperability, as you call it in the description, I think. And that to solve that, really, we think that interoperability needs to be considered as something of strategic importance for individual universities, but also for countries and the EU as a whole. And that we need also maybe a combination of both a little bit of a shared vision, but also maintaining flexibility and openness to differences. So we can't just we try to really craft out the shared vision into the last detail before we start getting to operational issues. That might take too long. So we need to have a shared vision, but also remain flexible and open, I think.
Sorry, I'm the moderator and I was on mute. My apologies. But in the context of the university, the EU university model, the European university, you raised a couple of themes, and I just want to pull some threads. One of them said, yes, there's the technical interoperability, which is the technology and the standards. That was just the tip. That wasn't really where it was challenging. If I've understood you correctly, it was ensuring there's that mutual understanding and equivalency. So that's the semantic, the business piece, which is the financial and access. But you also had a compliance component there, I would think. Was there some kind of European cross countries kind of regulatory framework that supported that particular project as an example?
Well, that's maybe that goes back to the initial point, that's always a tricky question in Europe, because on the one hand, in the education specific sphere, there is not really let's say a Europe-wide coherent regulatory framework, because we have the EU with the competence to facilitate cooperation, but at the same time national competence for education. However, there's a lot of coordination within the EU, also beyond the EU, in the so-called European higher education area, or Bologna process, where countries coordinate their policies on a voluntary basis. So there is a layer of legal interoperability that's created by that, you could say. But at the same time, of course, there are still quite some regulatory difference at national level. What is quite interesting when we find out in discussions on the interoperability framework, that there are, of course, other areas that play into this, where presumably Europe has a much stronger or much more coherent regulatory framework. Think of privacy regulations and the GDPR, sorry, no acronyms, General Data Protection Regulation, that the EU has enacted, which is legislation valid across the whole European Union. At the same time, we still saw from the messages that we got from universities that some alliances have struggles about it internally, because even though GDPR applies to everyone in the alliance, one university says, oh, we cannot do this because of data protection regulations, and another university thinks they can. So yeah, there are still quite some issues to be solved at that level.
The complexity is enormous. And Justin, when I think about the Velocity Network Foundation, what are some of the, when you reflect on what Colin shared and what they're dealing with in the European model, what are some of the elements that you think are key as you work with your communities to create a digital ecosystem?
So when it comes to having trust in an ecosystem, at least in my view, from what I've seen, it can't be at all ambiguous. People don't naturally trust each other. It can't just be implied. You have to create trust by how you set everything up. And I think that ties back into this whole notion of 5 layers of interoperability, in that you really need to have all 5, without at least for in this context, in terms of career credentials, you need to have all 5 for it to work in the real world. Technical, every one of them is important. So if you just have technical interoperability, if you just have the ability for a credential to go from an issuer to a wallet, have the individual hold it on their wallet, web or held, and then send it over to a relying party, and they can verify it. That's incredibly complicated to do, and it's a wonderful thing to have. But if you have just that alone, it's simply insufficient. It's the kind of thing that works in a plug fest or a hackathon, but not kind of in the real world, when you need to have a lot more there. And when you think about career credentials, it's a very complicated, multi-sided ecosystem. If you're thinking about just something like passports or driver's licenses, there's a single issuer, right? The passport's issued by the government. Maybe if you're a dual citizen, maybe there's 2. When it comes to someone's career, they may have 15, 20, 25 different unique issuers. And on the other side of that, there's literally an unlimited number of relying parties. Every single educational institution and every single employer is a potential relying party. So you can't set this up in a simple way where you simply have passport goes to the person, they present their passport at customs. It simply kind of doesn't work that way. So what we've found is you must make trust very, very clear, and you must do it at each of these layers. I don't know if you want me to go through kind of all 5 of them all at once here. Technical, I touched on. Structural, as you mentioned, this is the schemas. We have about 25 different schemas on the network. There's a standards committee that's part of the Velocity Network Foundation, who's responsible for those schemas. And the fact of the matter is, they actually didn't create most of the schemas. They took already existing and already in use schemas. And it's kind of a constantly iterative process of continuing to make sure the data can be mapped in a way that can be processed by human beings as well as machines, and that we're always taking into account emerging standards as we go. If we simply say, we got it, it's perfect, we would lose trust immediately under structural interoperability. Semantic interoperability is being able to kind of explain what things are beyond the credential. Most verifiable credentials are very, very small in their own right. It's a pretty simple thing that you can hold on an app. However, in many cases, you need more. So I'll use a personal example. I graduated from Fordham University Law School in New York City. Now, when I first came out of school and wanted to go to a law firm, it was pretty obvious to them what a law degree from Fordham meant in Manhattan. And it's pretty much the same as it would have been if I went to Columbia or NYU or Cardozo or Brooklyn Law School or any of those. But is it the same as it would have been had I gone to school in the UK or in Australia or in China or in Africa? As it is in many cases, a law degree is a first degree in places like Israel, where I am now, or in most of Europe, whereas in the United States, it's a professional degree. So having the ability to have a link from the credential to something like Credential Engine, or possibly even richer AI enabled solutions that give you the full picture of what that degree means for that university at that time in that place, because it can be very different between them. And then I'll just go through the last 2 very quickly. Legal interoperability is, as Colin mentioned, every institution is dealing with a regulatory framework in their own country, and they're all different. So the question is, how do you make that work in a global ecosystem, which is what we're talking about. And the way we've done it is every actor on the network must sign a different regulatory, you'll sign a legal agreement that lays out within the network what their potential liabilities are, what their responsibilities are. And this means you kind of know exactly what everyone else is committed to. And if there's a regulatory issue, you can point to that agreement. It's essentially a closed loop system where everyone understands what everyone else is committed to. This has been audited by DLA Piper. It's been audited across 5 different jurisdictions. We had a specialized law firm look at it for the FCRA. It's been presented to regulators across Europe related to GDPR, to California privacy, and it's always passed muster because there's this closed loop system. And for the simple fact that the way this works is that the only people who control their own data or have their data are the individuals about whom it's about. There's no personal data on the blockchain at all. There's no central repository. It's all controlled by the individual. And the last piece, I know I'm going long here, is business process interoperability. And this is the notion of, and the best illustration I've heard of this, to think about a cell phone. So if you are sitting in Belgium and you have your cell phone on Vodafone or Orange or whatever it's on, if you fly to the United States, you'll turn your phone off on the plane, turn it back on, and all of a sudden, magically, you're on T-Mobile or Verizon or AT&T. Now, you don't particularly care how that worked. All you care is that your phone works. But presumably, T-Mobile and AT&T and Verizon and Orange do care because they want to know who gets paid for your usage in each place. So behind the scenes, there are business process interoperability agreements between those companies. The Velocity Network Foundation has created a, not necessarily similar, I'm sure it's a very different system, but a system that works within this framework to make sure that you don't have someone presents 20 credentials, all with different business logic. Some require payment, some don't. Some are on this system, some are on that system. It creates a single kind of billing logic. So, and it's not feasible without this. If you do not put in payment rails and have a single kind of source of truth for business process interoperability, everything falls apart because everyone wants to know who's paying for what and who's getting paid for what. I'll stop.
You're laughing, Alex. Why?
No, because it was great. It was like there was so much content there, and it was so there's a lot to unpack and all that. And it was like, well, I'm just going to stop because at some point you just have to stop, right?
Well, I mean, I'm going to say to you, sir, what thread would you pull from that when you're thinking about creating effective digital ecosystems in your experience? You've represented standards organizations and the like. Tell us a little bit about that and what people need to keep in mind.
Well, I think what people need to keep in mind is, I think, the same things that Colin and Justin were just talking about, like what Justin was talking about with the lack of ambiguity. I think that's actually critical because I think when people are solely coming at this from the business standpoint, right, but are not awake to the technical and structural and semantic standpoint, they're like, oh, okay, well, we'll create a standard for this. And they wave their hands, say, we're going to do this. And then someone else has exactly the same vision, but creates something completely incompatible that doesn't actually work technically, semantically, structurally, and therefore all of a sudden those things actually don't create interoperability. There's no, we talk about paving the way, right? In a roadmap, there's no road, right? To drive on together. And so I think that's one of the keys. And one of the things that Colin said, like students moving seamlessly between countries, I think people think that's easy. People are like, oh yeah, I got a degree in engineering or I got a degree in, nursing. Of course it can. Well, my mother got a degree in nursing in Germany. She was an RN, a working professional RN. When she came to the United States, she had to start over again. She literally had to go to school again, even though she was a extremely skilled RN with experience, in Europe. And so it was, that kind of thing. It's not easy and it doesn't happen that often. I think it happens much less often than people think. And so the kind of work that, that kind of work is essential. And I think the thing to think about is I think this roadmap, paving the way, digital freeway kind of conversation is the right analogy to think of. Is you have a road, you have many kinds of vehicles on the road. Some of the vehicles might be blockchain, right? It might be velocity network, certifications. It might be PESC transcripts, right? It might be ADL, which is that's the defense laboratory that works with the U.S. military, right? It might be military records of knowledge, skills, aptitudes, right? So there's all sorts of different cars that could be driving on the road. And we need to figure out how the off-ramps and on-ramps work so that a person who got trained in the military can actually go and get credit for that skill that they have, where they're actually 10 times more skilled than another person, but they don't have a civilian certification for that. And how we figure out how an employer can figure out with it saying, I need people with these skills, how that employer can figure out that that person has the skills. That's part of that semantic layer, right? How do we interpret the fact that in the military, this person is said to be able to do this, and I need this? And it turns out those are actually the same skill, but they're represented in completely different language and in completely different contexts in the two verticals. And so that's part of what there is to pay attention to, and to really work out that unambiguous mechanism. And one of the ways that we have to do that is we have to have communication. We have to know if the credential is being stored in blockchain, and then what identity framework is being used. How do you know that Alex Jackl is actually Alex Jackl? Are you using a de-identifier identifier, right? Are you using some structure, or are you using some other authority like a driver's license or a passport number, or what are you using to uniquely identify someone? So there's a whole set of questions that are technically and structurally and semantically important to answer. However, for all of those things, you have different players playing in those hundreds of different like little arenas. Each of them is hungry for money. Each of them is hungry to survive because they need to. They need to pay their staff. They need to pay architects. They need to pay, their accountants. Their lawyers that they need to manage all the regulatory compliance that's necessary in these kinds of things. And so, how do you actually make these things sustainable so that you don't have hundreds of people trying to build the same thing? And the answer, I think, is as much as possible is communication, outreach, and standardization, making that unambiguous answer that let's all align on this. And that takes a little bit of people thinking outside of my answer is the only answer. And it takes a little bit of flexibility in people being willing to work with other people despite what needed. And those 5 layers, the technical, the structural, semantic, the compliance, the business, if any one of those legs of that 5-legged stool are missing, that stool's going to be unbalanced and eventually will fall over.
So Colin, you're in the middle of that with some of the work that you're doing, where you're actually kicking the tires and actually working on initiatives. What are some of the reflections you're thinking of as you sort of ponder what Alex has shared? You talked, for example, that the technical wasn't the high challenge. Was it that you're pulling different types of credentials from different people, different types of course modules? Was it the people process? Help us understand.
Yeah, I think what resonated with the last 2 comments with me is that one of the main outcomes of our discussions on interoperability was actually the need for better coordination of different standards. Because to stay in the analogy of roads, I think I mean, it's natural that different people, different organizations build different cars, and everyone wants to invent a new car and with a shinier paint and tire and so on. But I mean, sometimes the problem we saw is that people don't just invent a new car, but then they also just build a new road just for their car. So instead of just putting their car on existing roads, I think there's sometimes you see a lot of either reinventing the wheel, or people maybe just not deliberately reinventing the wheel, but people just solving one problem that someone else has already solved somewhere for something different. So, for example, if you think of the university sector, I mean, I won't even dare to say how many different Europe-wide systems of institutional identifiers we have. I mean, there are at least 5 of them, And sometimes you see that not even the same organization is coherent in what standards they use. So one thing that, for example, we actually just yesterday kicked off as a result of the first year discussion on the interoperability framework is a new kind of a coordination group on higher education interoperability that brings together, on the one hand, stakeholders like associations of universities, standardization organizations in the field, like for example, GDN for Europe, or also One Tech and others, and also actually different the European Commission as the one main actor that, of course, itself drives certain standards and also brings together different parts of the Commission to try and make sure that when people create a new standard or want to support a new standard in the future, that this is happening in better coordination with each other. So the idea is, of course, to pragmatically, we see that in some areas, for example, if you think of the higher education institutions publishing data on their learning opportunities, you have various data standards in which that could be done. Ideally, of course, you would have one single standard to rule them all, but we realize that sometimes it's not realistic to achieve, and sometimes there is actually maybe a good reason why certain things are covered by different standards and overlapping a bit.
Right.
So we try to use this coordination structure to, at least when this is the case, to map things better to each other and to make sure that things are compatible. Or maybe a good example that I could mention for the European higher education sector is maybe the question of university accreditation and digital credentials, which of course is something Justin referred to it as well. That of course the issuer and what is has the issuer been quality assured is an important element when deciding whether to trust a credential. When the EU set up the European digital credentials infrastructure, which is based on W3C verifiable credentials by now as well, they realized, okay, they need to back this with a database of accredited education providers to be trustworthy.
Yeah.
Luckily, they just didn't create another one, but said, okay, where there is something called a European Quality Assurance Register, which is managing a Europe-wide standard for quality assurance and accreditation, and that already has a database of accredited higher education institutions and programs. So luckily, these initiatives ended up being linked together, so that existing trust ecosystems were used, for example, in the field of digital credentials.
So it's funny you actually did spell out the acronym for ECAR. I always refer to it as ECAR.
And I have to disclose. I have to disclose that I'm biased because that was my former workplace, of course.
I appreciate that. But it's an interesting point, because another one that was mentioned was credential engine, for example. So that notion of connecting, and you, I think, mentioned that, Justin, that notion of identifying those trusted sources for key pieces of quality assurances is really interesting to me. And when you look at, I mean, VNF is in the career space, Justin, in terms of some of its work. You know, we don't often think about that when we think about issuers, like the institution issuing to the learner, not always thinking about the receiver at the end in terms of some of this work. What has VNF done to sort of build out that interoperability connection, if you will, that's similar to what Colin describes as ECAR, or what you described earlier vis-a-vis credential engines? So do you have like employers or regulatory bodies that you've connected with, or that your community is connected with?
Yes. I mean, just to kind of jump on a point that was made before, in terms of the problem with everyone kind of searching for kind of the last dollar or to compete with each other, and the problems that creates. Overcoming that problem was actually one of the main reasons the foundation came into existence in the first place. A variety of actors in education and corporate, as well as background screeners and others, essentially realized there was a problem. And the problem was the way data is shared is broken. That it hasn't changed in literally hundreds of years how somebody presents themselves. You basically either write down, if you go back hundreds of years, or you email, or you fax, or you use LinkedIn, and you say whatever you want about yourself. And then it's on that other side, the relying party, to figure out if you're telling the truth or lying or embellishing or anything else.
Right.
So all of these variety of actors realized we have a problem. This takes too long. It's too expensive, and we're also going to run into all kinds of problems with privacy regulation as it gets tighter. And they came together to form this foundation to create this network to overcome that problem. None of them were willing to say, okay, you're going to be in charge of all this, and I'll rely on you, my competitor, to do this. And very few of them actually wanted to take on the challenge by themselves either. So they said, okay,
right.
Let's put aside our differences to the extent you want to put it that way, and say, let's create a foundation together. We will work together to come up with a protocol that works for all of us. We will then continue to build our solutions and compete on top of that better data. And the notion would be that it would be beneficial to the entire industry. That's the basic notion behind the foundation. It's obviously overly simplistic. In terms of, sorry, Joanne, can you remind me what your question was after? I just wanted to get that in. In terms of how
I think I was asking if you had similar conversations around connecting to trusted sources,
yes.
But it's interesting the angle and the way you looked at it, where you pulled the thread about parties that would normally compete together. You created this foundation to sort of establish a shared trust base so that you could work together on the things that make sense to work together. That sounds very similar to what Colin is doing in Europe. And that's also, if I'm not mistaken, similar to what you're doing with the Data Standards United work. Is that correct, Alex?
Yes, absolutely. That's I think the major difference is that the focus, I think, of a lot of Justin's work is on the trust aspect, and that network of trust that's necessary for credentialing to work, and that ability for people to rely on the data that's coming through. And we're not not that, but that's not what our focus is. The Data Standards United is focused on I think on the technical, structural, and semantic structures, both infrastructure of moving the data and the modeling of the data. What is the content of the data? What kind of card do you need to have in order to move from an academic environment into a professional environment, or from a pre-K environment into a K-12 environment? So I think the idea is exactly the same, right? I think it's just our focus areas are slightly different, and I think very simpatico.
Yeah. So and your organization is a coalition of the willing. It's open.
That's right. That's right. It's an initiative where our intention is not to be another mouth to feed, not another organization, but rather an initiative of like-minded organizations that are all committed to having a workable ecosystem in which they can, for those that are competitive, that are organizations, that are businesses, that they can compete inside of, and for the standards bodies where they can actually promote the common good and do the right thing with the resources that we have available to us.
So, and I just want to remind my audience, you're more than welcome to ask questions in the Q&A, and I will weave them in and share them with our colleagues here. If there's any particular point that's a bit confusing or a particular thread you want to explore, please don't hesitate, and I'll do my best to keep on track of that. And call, what's coming clear for me is there's all those the first 3 of our 5 layers that are in the chat there about technical, structural, and semantic. But each of you are also talking about that vision piece, that coalition piece, that collaboration piece. Colin, you referred to it as vision, I think, at one point. Would you consider that layer to be a 6th place of interoperability that sort of overarches the 5 that are here? Or would you consider that as being part of the business? And I want to throw that question maybe to Colin first.
That's a good question. To be honest, I don't know. I mean, you could say maybe it should be a sixth layer that even comes before the business and compliance layer, because that might be a way how you maybe to unite spaces where you have different compliance models or different legal systems and different business systems. So yeah.
I wonder.
But of course, at the same time, it is also something maybe it's not just yeah. On the other hand, it might be a bit like limiting if you say it's just another layer, but it's rather it's also something that should transcend
Maybe it's
the
a
other
wrap.
layers. Maybe it's a wrap, yeah.
Yeah, that weaves through everything, right? Yeah, I agree. I don't know that it's a separate layer, but I think it weaves through everything, because I think the vision is important. And I don't mean a vision like a pithy saying that's, inspires people, once more into the breach, kind of thing. Although that's important, you got to get the troops rallied up, right? But I think but having a view of the world where it matters that everyone has a fair shot, that you're serving rural and urban, environments, that you're taking care of people from all sorts of different backgrounds, that you're making sure that any student can go to any place and have their skills and certifications recognized. All those kinds of things, that's part of the vision process, where that will then inform all the other 5 layers. You'll act differently based on or if your vision is, I'm going to destroy everyone else and my business will be the only thing that rules the entire universe, right? Then you'll have a different set of actions if you're coming from that space, right? And so I think it's important for us to align on vision. And I think it weaves through all 5 of the layers that we've been talking about.
So, go
I
ahead.
I agree. I definitely don't think it's a 6th layer, because I don't think it's actually interoperability itself.
Right.
The notion of kind of creating ecosystems that's working, for this to work, it requires people working together. If one organization goes, I'm going to start issuing credentials, nothing happens. They just go out into the ether and nobody cares. You need to have all 3 groups, issuers, individuals holding them, and relying parties to make this work. And the notion of kind of having a skills-based economy and driving adoption, having credentials that can be used and trusted anywhere, I think is more the outcome of the other 5. You need all 5 layers of interoperability to make people want to adopt this, because without them, it really doesn't have much utility.
So for the sake of just giving it a label, I'm going to suggest the wrap is the governance piece, if you will, maybe the vision piece, I don't know, the coordinating piece. But Colin, in Europe, you created interoperability principles. Did they transcend all these different layers? Was it part of the wrap? Or do you have principles that are guiding some of the work that you're doing?
Yeah, I think that, I mean, the work that we've been doing for the higher ed interoperability framework has been guided by the general so-called European interoperability framework that has been produced by the EU for all spheres of, well, initially for public administration. I mean, that transcends all 5 layers. I mean, and the European interoperability framework terminology, it's actually 4 layers rather than 5. I mean, it's kind of what's in the 5-layer ontology, so to say, called the structural layer, I think, is there split up between partly integrated to technical, partly to semantic. So basically you have technical, semantic, organizational, and legal. So these principles have been is something that we have that we have used in the work. But if I can just come back to the vision for 1 second, I think one problem maybe with the vision is that, let's say we as, what did you say before, Alex, data geeks and similar kind of people, for us, it's very easy to probably agree and sign up to a vision that involves interoperability, vendor neutrality, avoiding vendor lock-in, and so on and so forth. In quite some discussions, I feel that even when you look at let's say, small, medium-sized ad tech firms and their umbrella organizations or networks, they are also very happy to sign up to a vision that involves interoperability, because when the lock-in is not something that is in their interest. What we've heard from universities is when it comes to really big tech, as in Microsoft, Google, these are not necessarily the people who would share our vision. So, for example, we have had some universities that suggested that all European universities and alliances should get together to kind of negotiate together with some of the big tech firms, because it's not necessarily that we should expect some of them to just adopt or embark on our vision because they like it, but only if there's some commercial interest behind it. So I think that's yeah, maybe
So like an
something to
incentive
bear in
model.
mind of the vision.
Yeah, you mean like an incentive model of some kind.
Yes, yes.
Interesting. And, have you explored there's projects, for example, you spoke about, I think it was you, it might have been in another session where Europe is reaching out, for example, to places like Canada because they're hoping to bring standards in or adoption of standards or at least receptivity to standards in other regions and so on. Are you working with any of that stuff, Colin?
To be honest, not personally. I mean, I think there are a lot of projects and initiatives going on between, I think, Europe and all other continents. But I must admit, I'm not personally involved in any of those projects.
And if you think of the work that, Justin, you're doing with the Velocity Network Foundation, just if I may ask, you're a global foundation, correct? You
Yes.
have participants from all over the world, and DSU is working towards global.
Yep.
You are international in your work, right? And the work that you're doing in the EU in this space, Colin, is it primarily focused on the European member states? Some of these things we've been discussing today?
Yes, yes. Primarily, it's focused on the EU member states. I mean, which is of course a consequence of the fact that all this is commissioned and funded by the EU. And I mean, we always try to keep things as open as possible in general, of course, to any other country that would want to adopt standards or want to use standards. And I know what, for example, some of the things that are going on, I'm aware of that the other colleagues are working on is also, for example, to facilitate cooperation between Europe and Africa on issues such as qualifications databases and registries. So that's one thing. Of course, in the particular field of higher education, we luckily have the Bologna process, which goes way beyond the EU, but is strongly supported by the EU. So that already opens it to some more countries, and we always try to keep things as open as possible to countries. So, for example, also the European Universities Initiative, even though it's an EU program, it's at least also open to universities from all potential candidate states, for example, Western Balkan regions and so on. So yeah, it's the bottom line is it's always the EU because it's the nucleus, but we try to keep things as open as possible.
Yeah, that's what I found too. But one of the things that I'm really interested in probing a little bit and pulling a thread on, we've talked a little bit about it, but I want to bring it more out on the table. What do you think have been, in your experience, when you're creating these ecosystems, what do you think have been some of the challenges that others should be mindful of when doing this work? Maybe we'll start with you, Justin, because you're in the career space.
Sure. So the biggest challenge that we've faced is adoption, is people taking the step to adopt. Almost everyone I've ever spoken to in the 3 years I've been here, and that my colleagues probably tell you the same, is that when we lay out what this is, how the Velocity Network works, why it works as it does, how it builds trust, everything else that we talk about, that I spend a half an hour telling them what this is. I've never had someone say, that doesn't sound good. I mean, almost everyone says, wow, that's really innovative and that sounds great. And I think this is the way things are going. The challenge is to get a group together within a geography, right? This is not a place where kind of the free rider system works. You can't say, well, I'm going to sit on the sidelines, I'll wait for someone else to do it, and then I'll jump in. There has to be an kind of ecosystem approach and an ecosystem moving together, at least within an area. So what I would say to anyone who's thinking, what I try to tell people who are thinking about this, if you believe this will help what you do as a business, or in education, I mean, we deal with both. We can say, by the way, just to be clear, when we say career, we mean that very broadly. Anything related to career, which education certainly is. And if you believe, as I do, this is where this is ultimately going, there's no benefit to waiting for someone else to move. And that's really been our biggest challenge, is to get people to take the action and to move. All it will do is simply delay your benefit and the benefits to your industry in your location. And really the single biggest advantage, competitive advantage, is to do this first. Our belief is that over time, this will become more and more adopted, eventually ubiquitous, whether it's velocity qua velocity, which I hope and believe it will be, or something else. We're not going to be using unverified non-digital data for much longer. It just doesn't make sense anymore. And the biggest competitive advantage will be to those who get on board earliest. And frankly, the biggest competitive disadvantage is to be kind of the last, is to have everyone else kind of take advantage of the first several years when they really do have a major competitive advantage, and then jump in once their entire industry is doing this. So convincing people to move quickly has been the single biggest challenge. The technical piece works, and it works well. Everything else in terms of the other layers of interoperability, which we have said for years now, all need to be there, all do work. The structural piece works. The semantic piece is in place. All the legal frameworks exist and have cleared past muster with the relevant authorities. And there's payment rails and everything else that it makes it so it's clear kind of who's getting benefit for what. If you're contributing to the network, you receive a benefit for that. If you are a relying party, you pay for that benefit. And the individual, and this is something that's very important because Colin mentioned, for the data geeks in the world, this whole notion of interoperability and no vendor lock-in, people like talking about this. For the normal person who's going to use this, they have no interest in hearing about any of this. And really all of this is completely obscured to them. They have a simple wallet on their phone or a web-based wallet where they can curate their credentials, and it makes them easier for them to get a job. It's free for the workforce, and they don't really get into pretty much anything we've discussed here, nor would I guess most of them want to, and it just makes it obviously simpler for them not to.
But it is critical to figure this out in order to be successful in adoption, yes? Yeah.
Yes, without overcoming the cold start problem, this will not succeed. We have a three-sided cold start problem: issuers, individuals, and relying parties. And without getting kind of dense atomic networks going, whether it's in the US healthcare system, staffing in the UK, IT services in India, within education, without getting some of those flywheels going, and it is starting, but without really getting them going, yes, this would have a major problem succeeding.
So Justin's chosen adoption. Colin, what do you think is the biggest challenge in your work with interoperability?
Yeah, but I mean, obviously adoption would be a good candidate, but I don't want to repeat what you said. I think one of the main challenges is to get the right people together and talk to each other in time. I mean, just to make sure that everyone is aware of who else is doing what, and maybe in the similar domain, and to try and make sure that people don't reinvent the wheel, but build solutions that complement each other and not repeat each other. I mean, we've had some, I mean, I'm not trying to say that we have been the best at it, because we have also heard a lot of interesting comments when the interoperability framework was launched, that many people said like, oh, really great, this should have been there 5 years ago. And we always said, yeah, sorry, we might agree, but it's too late to fix that. Yeah, so bringing the right people to talk to each other, and make sure that their standards and their systems can align and complement each other. I think that is crucial.
So that's almost like same language, coalition of the willing. That's the biggest challenge, finding the right smart people to put in the right rooms to solve the challenge. And what about you?
And give them give them good food and wine.
Yeah.
I heard someone
That's the
saying
critical.
the most important aspect in standardization.
That is the most important. Yes, agreed. Agreed. Good food and wine. Um, the other thing though is, and I don't know how to do this. I don't actually know the answer. I just know the problem, right? So, is we have to figure out a way such that people who need to compete with each other can do so and can survive and thrive and participate, right? Because if you don't manage that ahead of time, then what happens is people start to compete, and it's not the healthy competition. It's competition that eats each other's success, right? And then all of a sudden people are like, oh, the whole space is confused, no one knows what to do, and then you get, oh, this state or this country is doing this thing, and this state and this country is doing this thing, and so I think that to whatever degree we can a business vision that's for the greater good can be created, that can actually allow for competition and allow for people to thrive, not just succeed, but to thrive, that's, I think, necessary. It's a necessary precondition. If you don't do that, you almost certainly, whatever effort it is to create at least a global ecosystem, a large scale ecosystem, whether nationally, like in the United States or in the European market, right? It will collapse if you don't take care of that consideration. So I think that's really important.
So that's interesting. So we've got the adoption piece, the putting the right people in the right room to solve the right problem. We've got the comments that you've made. It's for me, I think there's a role for government in some of this, or government incentive funding to help, and EU is a great example of that, to help sort of support the neutral space, to allow for innovation. In my experience in creating a digital ecosystem, that's where I found you could really start to kick tires, be innovative, and help to incentivize bringing people to the table, whether they were not-for-profits or corporations, because there's different types of business models. So I want to thank my audience for sharing thoughts. I can see Colin wants to get in a last word, so I'm going to give you that.
I just wanted to jump on that one because it's interesting that you mentioned the role of governance. Well, we discussed this coordination structure for higher education interoperability, and there were various ideas. Should this be convened by the EU, or should this be managed by an existing organization? And everyone was like clearly saying like, no, this should be done by the EU because they are kind of a neutral arbiter as a government, and they shouldn't be like one vendor inviting the others, because then everyone would view it maybe with a little bit of suspicion. Is it biased towards their interest or someone else?
Yeah, and the one that I did in Canada, the MyCreds one, we actually didn't have government support initially. And it was done by, we set it up so it could be led by a consortium, a not-for-profit that represented the schools. That was a model that happened to make sense in the day in order to get what Justin was talking about, which is get it set up, number one, but also get adoption and scale. And it supports over 2 million learners now. So it crosses multiple standards, et cetera, multiple types of technology pieces. It's really quite extraordinary. So I'm going to end here. Out of respect for your time, I want to say thank you to all my panelists for joining today. And we covered the topic of the 5 layers of interoperability. I can't help but noticing is depending on your jurisdiction, depending on the material you search, people have 4 layers, 5 layers, different layers. They call them different things. But I think we've brought some clarity to those, and they are also in the description for session 2. We're looking forward to audiences joining us for subsequent webinars. We have one actually at the end of April on the 30th, where we'll be talking to learn about the digital infrastructure building that's going on in the Caribbean, which is really interesting. I was talking to my St. Lucian colleague. They're launching over 100 different digital applications for citizens down in that particular region. There's some really interesting work going on. So we're going to hear more about that. We have a recognition, the tension between recognition, quantum computing, innovation and standards at another one that we're doing either in April or May, and a few more. We also have, and Amalia kindly put it in the chat, a convening May 28th to 30th in Toronto with the Pan-Canadian Consortium on Admissions. And we have our annual meeting in Oslo with the Norwegian government and SICT, the HKDR and SICT, which will be October the 29th to the 31st in Oslo. So lots going on, building out the conversation and supporting the community. Thank you, gentlemen, and have an absolutely wonderful day. Appreciate you taking the time.
Big pleasure.
you. Take
Thank
care.
you. Bye.
Bye.